So in this bonus video, I want to show you how to use the Web Animation API to improve some of the interface here. So right now, when we get the answer right or wrong, a lot of the interface just changes really suddenly, which is unnatural. Things don't change like this in the real world. Usually there's some kind of transition. So we're going to learn how to use CSS animations but from the JavaScript API. So before we were able to write some animations by defining keyframes and then applying them in CSS. But in JavaScript, you can do the same thing. We can represent keyframes as JavaScript objects, and then we can tell an element to animate once we have a reference to it using those keyframes, and then also using some other settings to control the duration, how many times it repeats, the easing, etc. So let's see this in action by manipulating this score function. So here, when we update the score, if we get something right, let me get this one right, the text changes here, but there's nothing to draw the eye to the fact that the score went up. There's a lot of ways that we could approach this. We could have like a little +1 that floats up on the screen momentarily. Or in this case, what we're going to do is just a simple animation and take this element and animate it so it kind of scales up and down a couple of times to draw the eye to the fact that the score just went up. So we have a reference to the score element here. And I think we want to animate the parent of the score element. So if we're looking at the score, this is the score element, but I think I kind of want to animate this whole container. And maybe let's flip back to the browser. I'm going to inspect it. And so this is the score. This is the container. If we do like a transform scale 1.2. So I think what we're going to do is something like this, where it smoothly goes to like 1.2 or so a couple of times to draw your eye to it. So we're going to animate this parent. And one way to do that is we can get the parent, or the, let's call it the score container element, by doing score element dot parent element. So this allows us to go one layer up in our structure here to go from the score to the enclosing list item. And then here we can call the animate function. So when we call the animate, we pass in some keyframes and then we pass in some options. So I'm going to define two variables here to make it a little bit easier to read. We'll call this the keyframes. And this is going to be an array of objects, and the options, which is going to be a object. And we'll just fill this in with like a duration of 1 second. And for keyframes, let's just see something happening. So we're going to define a couple of keyframes here. Let's do transform scale 1, and let's do a scale of 1.2. So we're going to pass in our keyframes first, and then our options second. And there are more options and more information about the keyframes in that URL that I had pulled up. I'll share that with you. Basically, if you just put in a bunch into this array a bunch of CSS properties, it spaces them out evenly in our timeline. But if you want to get more complicated and have more control, you can do that by looking through the documentation. So right now, we should see our score scale from 1 to 1.2, and it'll take about a second to do it. So there we go, 1 to 1.2. That doesn't do exactly what I want. I kind of want more of a heartbeat where it scales up and then scales back down. So I'm going to add another keyframe here to scale it back down. So it'll go 1 to 1.2 to 1. And I think that's a little slow. I want this to go faster. So I'm going to make it half a second, or 500 milliseconds. That's better. But I want it to repeat. I want it to do this maybe twice. And I'm also going to change the easing. So easing defines how the property changes from each keyframe to the next. I'm going to use ease in, ease out, and they're great tutorials online and visualizations that explain easing if you're curious. Whoops, got that wrong. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty decent. Draws the eye to the fact that the score just went up. So we can use the same process. So I'll throw a comment in here. Animate the score changing to draw the eye to the score. We want to do the same process when we're going to the next question. So instead of just waiting 1 second, let's actually animate and fade the current item out, and then we can fade the next item in. So let's start here with fading the current item out. Let's comment this out. And we want to get a reference to this top level item. So what we're going to do is grab the trivia item, that div. Let's do it in the browser here so we can plan out a little bit. We're going to grab this div and we're going to apply an opacity of 0. Except that it's going to be animated, so it's going to transition from 1 to 0 to become transparent. And when it goes all the way to 0, we'll remove it and we'll load the next item. So I need to get a reference to that trivia element, the root, by talking to the trivia container and querying for trivia item. And we'll define some keyframes here. We want to go from opacity 1 to opacity 0. And we need our animation options. So let's have this happen in 500 milliseconds. Let's add a delay. So here the animation is going to start, but this first keyframe, we're not going to reach that. We're not going to actually start playing the animation until 500 milliseconds in. So half a second, it'll just hang, and then it will animate out for half a second. And I think for easing, I want to use the ease in animation, easing function. So ease in. And then we can just apply this animation. So trivia element.animate, keyframes, options. Let's check it out. So that's looking pretty good. It is animating out. The reason why it is going back to full animation is because the animation has finished. And by default, that means that it goes back to its original state. But this isn't going to matter because as soon as the animation finishes, we are going to go ahead and stop this visual artifact because we're going to remove this element and load the next one in. So the way that we're going to do that is this animate method. What this gives back to us is an animation. And with that animation, this animation object has a event listener that we can listen to, or sorry, it has an event that we can listen to using add event listener called finish. And so this will run anytime the animation finishes. So if I console.log, done, let's increase the duration here so that we can see it in our console. So click, and then done shows up at the end. So instead of doing what we did here, where we just arbitrarily waited for a second before we loaded the next thing, we want to go to the next question when the animation finishes. And all we want to do is run that same logic we were running, where we clear the trivia, we increase the index by 1, and then either display game over or load the next thing. So now it should fade out. The next one should show up. And I'm going to drop this duration down a little bit. So this is looking pretty decent. I will leave it to you to add in the other animation where the next question fades in. You can see there's a little bit of jarring transition. The first question fades out, and the new one, when it displays, it doesn't fade in. So all you need to do is go ahead and reverse this animation that we were creating here. Go from 0 to 1 whenever we display the trivia item. Which I'm going to pause the video for a second. I will implement it and then I will show you what it should look like, but I'm not going to show you the code for generating it. So here's what that should look like. Fades out, the next one fades in. Fades out, the next one fades in. Okay, so that wraps up using the Web Animation API. It is a relatively new piece of the browser API, but a pretty cool one because it allows you to leverage your CSS knowledge from JavaScript.